Say again, I always say this when he comes. He's along with Dr. Coburn, he is a faithful attender of these hearings, and we're deeply grateful.
Well, I learned a lot, and these are important issues. Let me just chime in on my own opinion in terms of what's happened with the moderation and the rise of health care costs. Having been, purchasing health care for the last 31 years, I think the increase in deductibles over time, the advent of HSAs have actually begun reconnecting the consumer of the product, the payment of the product. I think that's gone a long way towards just starting to restrain costs, which is one of my big problems with the health care law. And then just a poor economy does not, that always depresses prices across the board. So I think those are the two primary factors. Mr. Rolando, there are a couple statements I just need to talk to you about. You talked about misinformation, outdated models in terms of calculating the liabilities. I personally think the elephant in the room here really is the GAO testimony that shows on their Table 1 an unfunded liability in total of $96 billion, basically $99 billion less a $3 billion surplus in FERS, which is what we're all talking about, this pre-funding. Mr. Raposa, you talked about being concerned. If I were a postal worker, I'd be concerned about that $96 billion unfunded liability. What am I missing here?
Were we referring to pensions or retiree health care?
I'm talking about the entire liability having to do with pensions and health care. And again, I know you can pick and choose the little individual section, but if I'm a retired postal worker, I'd be kind of concerned about the overall package that I've been promised and the financial stability of the postal system to make those payments.
As a postal worker, if I'm civil service, I'm pretty comfortable because I'm 100% funded for my retirement. If I'm a FERS employee, I'm pretty comfortable because we're overfunded or 100% or overfunded in that retirement system. As far as my retiree health care, the Postal Service has been making the premiums for 50-some years, continue to do so, and they have $50 billion in account to continue to do so.
So do you just reject that $96 billion unfunded liability in terms of...
No, I'm proud to work for a company that's more funded than any other company in the country for their retiree health benefits.
Senator Johnson, we don't have the tables in front of us, so I haven't seen the $96 billion liability, but we'd be happy to analyze
I would really suggest take a look at that GAO report.
Yes.
That's certainly what would concern me. Mr. Rolando, you also talked about that the losses are clearly, they have nothing to do with the lost revenue, but since in 2007 revenue was about $75 billion, now it's about $65 billion is what I get. That's a $10 billion drop, whereas operating expenses have been reduced by $3 billion. So operating expenses, 80% of which are labor, isn't that the primary cost driver, and isn't really what is the post office is struggling with is a dramatically changed business model where we are losing paper mail and they're having to grapple with that problem?
Well, it's a two-part question. I think that the percentage might be correct, but I don't believe the Postal Service is struggling with it at all. We're very labor-intensive. We go to every house 6 days a week all over the country with additional addresses added every year. So, of course, a large percent of your costs are going to be labor. That percentage used to be in the mid-80s. It's now in the high 70s as a result of the...
But again, isn't that the main driver in terms of the financial situation again, I think it's misleading to keep banging on this pre-funding of a liability that is, let's face it, pretty sensitive to just the assumptions, and that surplus can go away in a second based on the changing assumptions of those models.
It's one of the
also, by the way, what is the incorrect calculation on those? You're saying it's an outdated model. How should it be calculated? What's wrong with the model in terms of the calculation of the liability?
Okay, your first question, I believe it's the labor is a positive factor because of the productivity gains. The second question, the model you speak of, were you talking about the workers' compensation?
Yeah, you said that the calculation of the liabilities is based on outdated models, and they've got to modernize their calculation models.
Oh, okay. You're referring to the Siegel and the Hay reports with regard to the actuarial reports of the
whatever you were talking about.
Okay, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Again, I'm not an actuary, but the independent reports indicated that if you use and the GAO themselves said all of those methods were acceptable methods. It was just a matter of a policy decision by the Congress.
Dr. Holtz-Aiken, can you chime in on that?
I haven't seen the Siegel report. I'd be happy to look at it and get back to you.
Okay, I mean, do you question the GAO calculations in terms of unfunded liabilities, $96 billion?
No, not fundamentally. I think
Let me just caution you. The Siegel report has revisionist history in it in terms of what the deal was in 1983 when all the assets were transferred to the post office and the obligations were assumed by the Postal Service. So they've totally discounted that in this analysis, which you cannot discount.
If I can comment on the methodological issue, I think the question is whether you take life expectancy specific to the population, to the postal workers, and I believe those are somewhat less than, the overall population. I think that's a methodological issue.
Again, to me, we're quibbling with details when you're talking about a $96 billion. I mean, what difference would it make? I mean, would it be $93 billion versus $99 billion? I mean, we're probably talking about that order of magnitude in terms of the differences based on the calculation, wouldn't we? Nothing significant?
Oh, I don't know. I'd take a look. I mean, as we know, healthcare costs have grown faster than any discount rate that's out there in the market for quite a while now. And so when you assume they moderate and how fast they moderate drives the calculation.
Let me talk a little bit about just average cost of benefits compensation. A couple of years ago when I was running, I saw a study that showed that the average cost of federal workers is about a little over $120,000. Average cost, total cost, that's pay and benefits of private sector is about $65,000. And you can see, just in terms of benefits, $35,000 for postal worker, $10,000 in the private sector. Dr. Holtz-Aiken, can you just comment on how did it get that outsized?
I don't have a complete history of the Postal Service. I guess this
I was
is
saying in
why
terms of federal workers in general, as head of CBO, just your comment on that.
they're not comparable. I mean, look at the post office. It's not a private sector entity. If so, it would be bankrupt. I mean, that's what the accounting tells you. It's got a government-provided monopoly for particular lines of business. Monopolies do things very differently, and often they pad their payrolls on top of everything else. We've seen a lot of that. It's true across the government. So that's why the focus going forward has to be not the timing of this agreed-upon decision to honor the retiree health costs. It's about the business fundamentals. What does labor cost as a labor-intensive industry, and what are the lines of business they're going to serve? That's it. If they don't fix that, you don't fix things.
So coming from the private sector as an accountant, I always had to benchmark my costs, wherever they were, whether it was material costs versus labor costs versus benefit costs, against people I compete with. And that's really what you're talking about is in terms of the fundamentals, we have to benchmark what we're paying in total, postal workers, versus what the private sector, who they will have to compete against, whether it's FedEx, whether it's UPS. We're going to have to get those costs in line, and primarily with Postal Service, it's labor costs have got to get in line with the private sector over time.
And the places we've seen the government struggle the most are those places where new competition has arisen to things that were previously exclusively government monopolies. That's true here.
Okay, well, thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Coburn.
I just had one more, and I wanted to hear your all's response to one of the comments Dr. Baker made about getting a better return on the funds that we have today. For example, when we're investing in T-bills instead of invested in a complex portfolio that's balanced against risk, what would you all think if you heard a proposal like that where we actually got more bang for our buck on the invested dollars? What would be your all's position with that?
Well, I wouldn't want to, put it in timbers or something like that, but I think...
That's okay. We don't carve in trees in Oklahoma because we don't have that many.
I don't think it would be a bad idea to look at the different funds in the thrift savings plans where postal employees already have their life savings and, look at a little better return there, something safe that has some precedent.
Okay, Mr. Hagerty?
I agree with President Rolando. I think the thrift savings life cycle funds, whether you look at the L40 or the L50, the risk gets spread out over time. The returns would be significantly more than T-bills. I agree with Fred.
Doug Holtz-Aiken, what do you think about that?
I am far more cautious. We've been through this war with Social Security, and this line of reasoning is the one that says that, number one, the Postal Service gets the upside, taxpayers get the downside if they don't perform. And number two, if this logic really worked, we should issue, say, $16 trillion more in treasuries invested in the stock market, pocket the difference as a federal government.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just chime in on that?
Sure.
Also, a couple of years ago, as I was running, I did my own little model. I'm an accountant. I do spreadsheets. And I just took a look at Social Security surplus. Had we invested that, and I realized these didn't exist back then, but a Dow Jones index fund, totally exclusive of dividends. Had we done that, and this is a couple of years ago, it'd be a far better result today. We would have $5 trillion in a trust fund that was a real asset to the federal government. A real asset versus a $2.6 trillion trust fund invested in Treasury bonds that has zero value to the federal government because they have offsetting liabilities in the Treasury. So, yeah, can we do it at this point in time? You know, at some point in time, you're better off starting to do the right thing as opposed to doing the wrong thing.
Gentlemen, it's been a real good hearing. And first panel was very helpful. Second panel, Postmaster General, you and Ron, I thank you for staying to hear this second panel. I think y'all did a real good job. And I thank my colleagues for being here.